For over 60 years, a small island has stood under siege. Not by accident, not by nature, but by design. An economic were meant to starve a revolution. This is the story of Cuba, not just a country, but an experiment the powerful tried to crush. And if you want more stories like this, stories buried beneath propaganda, subscribe to the channel now, because history is deeper than what we're told. Before socialism, before revolution, before resistance, Cuba was not free. It was a playground for foreign capital, a nation in name, but a colony in function. Under the dictatorship of Fulgencio Batista, the island became an extension of American economic power. Its sugar, its land, its industries, controlled not by its people, but by foreign corporations. Havana glittered on the surface, filled with casinos, mafia networks, and luxury for the elite, while in the countryside, millions of Cubans lived in deep poverty, locked out of education, trapped in cycles of hunger and illiteracy. This was not development. It was dependency, a small island economy designed to serve imperial interests, not human needs. But history does not stand still. Revolution did not begin in Havana. It began in exile. In 1953, a young lawyer named Fidel Castro led a failed uprising. He was captured, imprisoned, and eventually exiled. But exile did not silence him. It transformed him. In Mexico, far from home, the revolution was reborn, not as an idea, but as a plan. There, Fidel gathered a small group of committed revolutionaries. Among them was Che Guevara, a trained physician, but became deeply committed to revolutionary ideals after witnessing widespread poverty and oppression during travels across Latin America. There was also Raul Castro, Fidel Castro's younger brother, disciplined and strategic. Together, they formed a movement that believed Cuba could break free, not through negotiation, but through struggle. They were not backed by wealth. They had no army, only conviction. In 1956, they returned to Cuba aboard a small yacht called the Granma. The landing was disastrous. Most were killed. The dream could have ended there, but it didn't. A handful survived and retreated into the Sierra Maestra Mountains. From there, they began to rebuild, not just a force, but a movement. They organized peasants, gained the trust of rural communities, and waged a guerrilla war against Batista's forces. Slowly, the balance shifted. Batista's army, bloated with corruption and fear, began to crumble under pressure from a movement that could not be easily crushed. By 1959, Batista fled the country. The revolution had won. But victory was only the beginning. With Batista gone, Fidel Castro emerged as the central figure of a new Cuba. Yet the revolution did not stop at removing a dictator. It sought to dismantle the system that had made dictatorship possible. Land was redistributed to peasants. Foreign-owned industries were nationalized. Education and healthcare were declared fundamental rights, not privileges for the few. For the first time, Cuba began to belong to Cubans. But this transformation sent shockwaves far beyond the island. The United States did not see Cuba as just another country. It saw a threat. Because if Cuba succeeded, if a small nation could reject capitalism, reclaim its resources, and survive, then others might follow. So the response was not dialogue. It was punishment. An economic blockade was imposed, cutting Cuba off from trade, finance, and global markets. Over time, it tightened. Laws like the Torricelli Act and the Helms-Burton Act extended its reach, restricting access even to essential goods, including medicine. This was not simply foreign policy. It was economic warfare. And then came invasion. In 1961, the United States backed an armed attempt to overthrow the Cuban government, what would become known as the Bay of Pigs invasion. Cuban exiles were trained, funded, and sent to reclaim the island. But something happened that the planners did not expect. The Cuban people fought back. Within days, the invasion collapsed. It was not just a military defeat. It was a symbolic one. A small island standing its ground against one of the most powerful nations on earth. Now fully isolated, Cuba faced a choice: collapse under pressure or transform under it. It chose transformation. Across the island, literacy campaigns spread into the most remote villages. Teachers, many of them young volunteers, carried books into places that had never seen formal education. Illiteracy, once widespread, was nearly eliminated, reaching close to universal levels. Healthcare followed a similar path. A system built not for profit, but for people, emerged under immense constraint. Doctors were trained in large numbers. Clinics reached rural areas. Life expectancy rose steadily, climbing to levels comparable with developed nations. Infant mortality dropped dramatically. This was the contradiction that critics could not easily explain. How does a poor, sanctioned country achieve outcomes that rival the richest nations? And yet, the narrative persisted. Socialism does not work. But compared to what? Compared to a system that had already failed the majority before the revolution? Compared to a global order that punished any attempt at independence? For over 6 decades, Cuba has existed under conditions designed to make it fail. Restricted trade, limited access to resources, continuous economic pressure. And still, it survives. Not only survives, but builds. And perhaps most remarkably, it gives. While under blockade, Cuba turned outward, not with corporations or military force, but with doctors. Medical brigades were sent across the global south, to Africa, to Latin America, to disaster zones and pandemic-stricken regions. Cuban doctors treated patients in places abandoned by wealthier nations. They trained new generations of medical professionals from poorer countries, creating a legacy of solidarity rather than extraction. As of today, Cuba remains the global leader in the number of teachers and doctors per capita. Even under siege, Cuba chose internationalism. But the war never ended. It adapted. In recent years, the pressure did not fade. It tightened. What had once been a blockade became something far more precise, targeted at the very lifeline of modern society: energy. For decades, Cuba depended heavily on oil imports, particularly from Venezuela. It was not a luxury. It was survival. Power plants, hospitals, transportation, everything depended on that flow. Then the flow was interrupted. Under the administration of Donald Trump, the United States escalated its strategy, not just against Cuba, but against Venezuela itself. A sweeping effort to control Venezuelan oil exports took shape, including sanctions, seizures of oil tankers, and direct pressure on any country attempting to supply Cuba. At one point, a full blockade was imposed on Venezuelan oil routes, cutting off one of Cuba's primary energy sources. And the consequences were immediate. Oil shipments dropped drastically. In some periods, supplies fell to a fraction of what the island needed to function. Then came the blackouts. Entire regions went dark. Cities, homes, hospitals. Millions were left without electricity as the national grid collapsed under fuel shortages. In operating rooms, surgeries were delayed. In hospital wards, machines that depended on electricity faltered. Refrigeration systems for medicine failed. Critical care became a struggle against time and darkness. This is not abstract policy. This is lived reality. Even the United Nations warned of a potential humanitarian collapse if Cuba's access to fuel continued to be blocked. This is what economic warfare looks like, not in theory, but in its human cost. And yet, Cuba is not perfect. No revolution is. It has faced contradictions, limitations, and internal struggles. But perfection was never the measure. The measure is endurance. For over 60 years, a small island has resisted domination. It has been sanctioned, isolated, invaded, and pressured in ways few nations have endured continuously. And still it stands. Not because it was allowed to succeed, but because it refused to surrender. And history does not begin with suffering. It remembers solidarity. This same Cuba, under Fidel Castro, sent soldiers and doctors to support liberation movements across the global south. In Africa, Cuban forces played a decisive role in the struggle against apartheid in Angola, contributing to the conditions that helped bring down white minority rule in South Africa. And beyond the battlefield, Cuba sent teachers, doctors, builders of human dignity. A man like Che Guevara did not die in comfort. He died in Bolivia, far from home, still fighting what he believed was a global struggle against imperial domination, after standing with revolutionary movements in places like Congo. This is the legacy often erased. A country under siege, still choosing to give. So the question is no longer just about Cuba. It is about us. What does it mean when a nation is punished for choosing a different path? What does it mean when survival itself becomes resistance? And what responsibility falls on the rest of the world? To the global south, to Africa, to Latin America, to Asia. This history is not distant. It is familiar. Cuba stood with others. Now the question is, who stands with Cuba? History does not always shout. Sometimes it whispers through blackouts, through resilience, through people who refuse to disappear. And Cuba is still speaking. If this story made you question what you've been told, if it challenged the narrative, then don't let it end here. Like this video, share it, and subscribe to the channel, because these stories matter, and they are not often told. Organize, resist, and be unbreakable.